All right, welcome back to the Prolific Author Podcast. We are here today with author Lisa M. Lilly. How are you today, Lisa?
Great, and I'm so happy to be here. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks. Yeah. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to talk about some of the things that I think you have to offer. But why don't we start by just having you introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you write?
I'm Lisa M. Lilly. I write thrillers and mysteries. My ongoing series is the QC Davis Mysteries. It features a lawyer, a lawyer sleuth in Chicago who initially starts solving crimes because her boyfriend dies suddenly. The police believe he died by suicide, and
Mm,
she doesn't buy it. And she has a lingering distrust of police because back in her family's history, there's an unsolved murder. So that
yeah.
drives her forward. And I'm on the sixth book in that now. The first one is The Worried Man. I also wrote a supernatural thriller series. It's complete, the Awakening series. And it follows a young woman who becomes the focus of a powerful fringe religious cult that
Mm,
believes at first she's going to give birth to a Messiah, but they come to believe she will actually trigger an apocalypse. So it follows her after that. And I write under LM Lilly a series of books for writers. It's a writing as a second career series.
nice.
Oh, and I host a podcast too. Almost forgot that. And I'm on a podcast, Buffy and the Art of Story. And I break down every episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer using the same plot structure and story structure that I cover in some of my writing as a second career book. So it's a lot of fun if you're a Buffy fan.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. And you had mentioned that before. I'm like one of those weird people that have never actually watched Buffy. So,
Ah, no.
but if I ever do, yeah, that would be really interesting to like watch each episode and then listen to your podcast because that's actually something that I do sometimes is break down stories, using plot structures and everything. So, yeah, that it actually does interest me. I just am not very familiar with the subject material.
The first podcast I ever listened to was one breaking down each episode of Buffy and looking at not just plot, but why does it work? Why doesn't it work? And I learned so much from it, including
Yeah.
when I didn't like an episode. The hosts were great at pinpointing things, and I'd think, oh, that's why that didn't quite land. And then it helped me tremendously with my own writing. I knew I always admired the writing in the show, but I never really broke it down. So when I started podcasting, that's what I decided to do.
Yeah. And I love that you said that you learned so much because I think by analyzing stories, it's not always the best thing to try to force your story into a template, but when you can pull out these points of other stories, it just teaches you a lot about the different elements that need to come into a story in order to keep the audience engaged.
Yeah, and it's so much easier to see in someone else's work.
Right.
And
Yes.
I think in some ways it's more helpful than I had been for years in writers' groups, which can be really useful. But depending what level people are at, you might be
Mhm.
looking at issues that you've already mastered, let's say grammar or something like sentence
Right.
structure. But when you look at something that you love and you say, "Oh, why do I love this so much? Why does it work?" You just learn.
Yeah. And actually, that's something that I always encourage people to do. I always say, even if there's, say, you're watching a movie and for the most part, you didn't really like it, it didn't really land with you, but there's one scene that you're like, oh, I liked that. Sit down and analyze the reasons behind that because you can apply it to your own writing. And if you liked it a lot, you're having an emotional reaction to it, which means on some level it worked.
Yeah, definitely. Lately, I never had watched Grey's Anatomy, and I started watching because I read a book about how good Shonda Rhimes is on keeping people watching, and that is so educational. Like every last scene, I'm like, oh no, I have to watch the next one.
Right.
So that's my next goal to really master that.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think I think about that enough in my writing, so that's a good point. So tell us more about how you help other authors then through your books on I love that it's writing as a second career that you specifically call it that.
Yeah, it started out with a website I founded of the same name. And it was my goal in starting it was to speak to authors and writers who had another full-time career or job, or maybe more than full-time, or maybe they have a job and they're caring for children, but a life that's not predictable, that they don't have a regular schedule. Because it seemed to me that a lot of advice out there is premised on the idea that, oh, you can write at the same time every day, or you should turn out X number of books a year and you shouldn't deviate. And in certain types of lives, that's not possible. I had times as a lawyer when I worked 2 months straight and literally did nothing but eat, sleep, and work on my cases. I was already getting up early to finish my
Right.
work and staying up late and eating at my desk, and all the times that people say, oh, here's where you fit in your writing. But yeah, when that was done, I went back to a good writing habit. You just have to create it differently. So that's a lot of what's on the website. And I have a couple books aimed at that part of writing. I have one called Happiness, Anxiety, and Writing, which is kind of about dealing with the anxiety just in life, but also as a writer that comes with it. And then my more craft focused books started as I wanted to do a handout for people on the website that they could download, join the email list. And it was 5 major story structure points that I use and figured out based on a lot of screenwriting books and like what you did, taking apart a book I loved or a film I loved. And people found it so helpful and kept writing me and saying, oh, this is so much simpler. And I've read so many complicated plot books, and this really helped me, that I created the first book in the series, Super Simple Story Structure, and then later went on to take that as well and put it into the One-Year Novelist, which helps people both use that structure and fit it in to their life, no matter what else they've got going on. So it's like it's a week by week guide.
Nice.
And after that, I just kind of looked at what are people asking me for? What are they saying they're struggling with? And that's what I keep trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you like to share more about your plot points that you use?
Yes, I read yours on your site. I love seeing what everyone does for this, because I think different structures can resonate with different people and at different times. I tried to do mine in a way that would work for any type of story. So I use examples from The Terminator, the first movie, and Pride and Prejudice, which I notice you also love.
Yeah.
So I look at, it ended up being a couple more points. I look at opening conflict, because I feel like when I was a new writer, I tended to do that, start in the ordinary life. And I miss that, start in the ordinary life, but there should be conflict. In The Terminator, Sarah Connor's ordinary life is as a waitress, but it's a kid's dumping ice cream into her pocket and a guy's slapping her butt and being really creepy, and she's getting the orders wrong. Like, there's conflict. So I talk about opening conflict, then this inciting incident or story spark that sets off your main plot. And then I divide it up in quarters. So I look at the first quarter way through. I think of it as the 1/4 twist. And it should come from outside the protagonist. In almost every story, if you look at a novel, 25% through, something major happens from outside the protagonist that spins the story in a different direction and sends it toward the midpoint of the book. And then the midpoint, and this for me as a writer was key, because I never knew what to do in the middle. It would kind of sag and I'd falter.
Yeah.
Until I was working with a screenwriting coach who said, your main character should make a major commitment, throw caution to the wind, or suffer a major reversal, or both. And your antagonist might do that too. So I'm going to do a little spoiler here. So for Pride and Prejudice, Darcy, our antagonist, throws caution to the wind by proposing to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, in the way she rejects him, throws caution to the wind. Like, she is so just, at the time, we all feel justifiably so, just mean to him, tells him if he was the last man on earth, there was nothing he could say that make her accept his proposal. So it's like she's closing all the doors, which it turns out maybe she shouldn't have done that. So that's that super strong midpoint. And
Mm-hmm.
then about three quarters through, there's the last major plot turn. And in screenplays, this might be more like a third through, or it could be a little later, but books almost always a quarter way through. It's a turn that takes the story again in a new direction, but it should come out of that midpoint. So from the midpoint on, your protagonist is active, and now they're taking it in another direction, and it should probably raise the stakes. And finally, the climax, everyone knows what a climax is. Your two main characters, your opposing forces have their final confrontation. And then I look at just falling action. What happens then? We tie up loose ends, resolve subplots. If you have a series, maybe there's that hook to keep
Right.
people going to the next book. So I've used that for every book I've written. And what I like is you can start with that if you want. And if you're an outliner, you're a plotter, you can fill in what happens in between before you
Mhm.
write. But if you love discovery writing and figuring it out as you go, you could just sort that out as you write. So it's a really flexible framework.
Right, right. And I like to say too, sometimes that pantsers, even if they are the kind of people that don't want to use a framework at all, they don't even want to look at it, they can always come back and use it as like a checks and balances to see where their story might be sagging and they might be missing something.
Yeah, I found a lot of writers I've worked with, they use it on rewrite. So they've
Mhm.
got this draft, and just like you said, they're not sure, why is it sagging here, or maybe why does this change feel too abrupt? And it can really help them sort out those plot issues and
Right,
shape it so your pace, it helps with your pace, and maybe figure out, oh, there, we need something else here. Like this is just scene
yeah,
after scene, and something more needs to happen.
right, right. So when you say you work with writers, are you a writing coach then?
I do some writing coaching one on one. I also will look at other writers if they're starting out, maybe they've got a few chapters and they want someone to look at their overall plot. So I'll
Hmm.
have them, I've got story structure worksheets you can get on my website, or I'll send them to them and they can either fill those out with those major points and some other things on there about goals and their characters, or they can send me an outline and I'll look at that and send that back to them before they spend forever writing that
Right.
draft. And I offer that because I found that tremendously helpful when I was writing. I had a writing instructor I'd gone to a retreat with, and he did that for me for a few of my novels, and it saved me so much time. I
Yeah.
actually waited till I wrote the first draft, and then I got really depressed when he sent me the comments, and I'm like, oh, I seriously thought this was working. So I learned to send earlier, right, maybe a third, and send him that in the outline. So I
Right.
offer that as well for writers, and then sometimes. Um, I'll help a little bit with marketing if someone just is like, how do I get my book in front of people?
Hmm.
And that's an hourly thing.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's funny that so often we hear early writers saying things like, I don't want story structure. It just kind of bogs you down, or I don't need that. And as you go along, you all writers learn that they need to include certain elements. So, what would you say to someone who's thinking that plotting and story structure doesn't really apply to them?
I would say two things. One, like we've talked about, you don't have to plot the whole thing. So maybe just pick one or two of those points that you probably have in mind already. You might know what your
Hmm.
climax is, or you might know there's this one major turn. So you're probably plotting somewhere in your head. But the other thing is look at the books you love. You go
Hmm.
look at them, or movies. I've literally paused the movie at halfway through what's happening. The first Star Wars movie, halfway through, spoiler again, but it came out in the 70s. So
Right.
the entire planet Alderaan is destroyed, and Luke
Hmm.
was going there to meet with Leia, and this was the big thing, and it's destroyed. Major reversal. So pause the movie or take your favorite book. I did this with the Stephen King book I love, The Dead Zone, and open it up at the middle. Open it up and see what the authors are doing. And then, if you don't want to plan in advance, don't plan in advance. But like you said, at some point, you're probably going to have to look at that. So
Hmm.
it's more deciding when and how you're going
Right.
to do it.
And maybe also too, I mean, if people are just writing for themselves, doodling around, then maybe they don't need to. It's just for
Yeah.
them. But I think it's specifically if you want to get your book in front of people and make money on it and turn it into a business, which nobody would be listening to this if they didn't want that. So
Right.
you have to be willing to serve your reader, which means you have to be willing to write a story that a reader can connect to and stay engaged in.
Yeah, and I think you can also look at it as a time issue. Or I started plotting my first book I wrote after college. None of these ever saw the light of day, but the first one was just what they call a slice of life. It was like a middle grade novel. And it was okay, but there was no clear story structure. The second one I tried the same way, and this time I saw what was happening, but I had to throw out half the book, and that made me feel sick because it had taken me over a
Right.
year to write that. I was working full time. And that's when I said, oh, I got to do something. There must be something else I can do. And that's when I started looking more at plot. So it can help to think of it less as plot and structure and more as how can I use my time better? How can I write, if not write faster, maybe you write super fast as a discovery writer, but speed up that rewrite
Yeah,
process.
I agree. I agree. It's interesting how, I mean, I think most people would say the biggest loss they could think of would be of money. And of course, if you're hurting for money,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
definitely true. But as a writer, you learn that time is so valuable. The amount of time it takes to create something and wanting to create a lot of it and get it to readers quickly. You just kind of learn a lot about what your time is worth.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us undervalue our time. I've done it myself, and I feel like it's especially strange to me because when I practice law full time, I still practice a little, but I would work at least 50 hours a week. That was an easy week, but I knew exactly how I spent my time because I billed it by the hour. And my clients, I'd have to fill out these timesheets in literally 6-minute increments and categorize what I did
Wow.
in every 6 minutes by coding it. And maybe in reaction against that, as an author, I have not been very good at that. So I do think about efficiency, but there's part of me that resists trying to be too efficient or really track my time. And so I empathize with people who are like, oh no, I just want to dive in. I just want to do it. I don't want to think
Right.
about the process. And yet, yeah, you find yourself down the road thinking, oh, was that worth all that time? Or look at how long I spent on that. And it doesn't feel as good. It doesn't feel as exciting or as creative if you feel like you're writing and you're not doing as much with it. Or to your point, you want readers to read your work. Most people
Hmm.
do. Maybe some people do write just for themselves,
Right.
and that's fun and that's fine, and it's probably very stress-free.
Yeah.
But if you want your work out there, even if you don't need to make a lot of money on it, you want readers to read it. So
Right.
you do want it to be gripping. You don't want to spend all that time to have 5 of your friends download it and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you said that it was more exciting when you felt like you were doing something with it because I do feel that like I am a pretty hardcore outliner and I recognize that not everybody writes the same way. But I also feel like if I know exactly what points to outline so that I know I have confidence that the reader is going to love the story, then it's way more exciting than just going, okay, well, this is what I want to do. I hope somebody likes it. You know what I mean? It's just it's empowering, really.
Yeah, it makes it a more fun process. And I think there's, for me, less anxiety. And there's some of
Hmm.
that too. I feel more anxious if I don't have any idea where I'm going.
Right.
When I took writing in college, I got a degree in writing in English and it was creative writing focused. But one thing that frustrated me in the program is they didn't teach plot. That's why I had to go over to the screenwriting people because their view of fiction was, well, you work on writing a really great scene. I learned to write really strong scenes. I learned to write whether I felt like it or not. It was good for turning out pages. But the theory of a novel was, well, you just string scenes together. And
Mm.
I discovered, for me at least, yeah, that doesn't lead to an engaging novel, just stringing
No.
one scene after another. And to your point, it's not that much fun because you start feeling like you're just plodding along and saying, "Oh, okay, well, what could they do now?" And
Right.
for me, that isn't as engaging. Maybe because I like strongly plotted novels. I
Yeah.
like mystery and science fiction and thrillers, and I like a good story. I like good characters, but I want a good story.
Right. And I think the problem is that a good story should feel cohesive from beginning to end, you know. It shouldn't be this happened, then this happened. It should be this happened and therefore this happened. And so there's a cause and effect sort of chain. I was going to say, I remember reading a book in college in one of my creative writing classes, and it was the whole idea was that the format of the book was that every chapter was a vignette, which meant it could function as a
Okay.
self-possessing or a completely self-possessed story. And that was fine. Like the story was good, the book was good for what it was. I appreciated learning about that format. But because you could read them all as independent stories and they didn't have a thread to tie through all of them, the entire book didn't feel like one big story. It felt like a series of stories. So I guess if you're trying to do that, that's totally fine, but that's not what most readers are looking for in a single story.
Yeah, I agree. And we probably went to a similar type of
Yeah,
program, and maybe it reflects a difference between, yeah, what are you trying to write?
right.
Because yeah, for the same reason I don't tend to read collections of short stories, I'm not a big fan of novels that work that way. I've read a
Right.
couple I've loved, but it's the exception for me, and I'm
Yes.
with you. I want it to tie together, and I think that causality issue is key. There should one scene should flow from the next. Occasionally you're going to go a different direction for a while, but ultimately it should connect up in
Mm-hmm.
a causal way. Otherwise, I don't know. I feel like we could just watch ordinary life, and
Yeah.
we wouldn't need to read a fiction. Fiction imposes order on a story or creates some kind of resolution that we don't always have in real life.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. And I think our brains are always looking for patterns, which we do when we're
Mhm.
reading stories. And so that you can find patterns within a short story for sure. But then if that story ends and you're in the same book, but you're moving on, like you said, to a different short story, the brain kind of reacts against that and goes, no, I want more of this because I'm already invested in this, you know? And so it's just more likely to keep reading the same story for longer than to hop between kind of irrelevant scenes, you know?
Yeah, I'm definitely in that same camp. Once I get invested in the story, I want more of that story. I want
Right.
more of those characters. And a lot of what keeps people reading is the same reason you and I do, to know, well, this happened here, and then what happened next? Like, what did that cause? Where did the characters have to go because of this? That's what keeps you tuning in or clicking the button on Netflix for the next
Right.
episode.
Right. I totally agree. I totally agree. So, what advice would you give to a brand new writer who's just up and coming, and you know, from your experience, what would you tell them?
Um, so having just said all this about plot and structure, my advice is, if that is stopping you from writing, if you feel like, oh, I have to know this whole structure before I write, or I can't get words on the page, then I would say just start with whatever engages you. If it's a character, if it's a certain scene, just write. Because the biggest thing is to get the words on the page in the beginning. So start with what you love and write a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with writing a chapter or two chapters and then sorting out your plot. And we've been talking about how hard it is to throw away pages, but in the beginning, you do. Sometimes you
Hmm.
might write three chapters and then realize, oh, here's where my story starts. What I've
Right.
written is backstory, and that's okay because you want to know the backstory too. Some of us think by writing. So that's a big one, is whatever it is that you are excited about, that's a great place to start your story, and you don't have to know where it's going. I would just say, once you've gotten it underway, or maybe you've written a bunch of notes, then maybe think about where you're going with this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that advice. That's really great. Well, and you know, I was thinking as you were talking that in a way, it almost becomes, I don't want to say because I guess it's kind of an all over the place situation. I was thinking that I just had another interview before this when I was telling him that I have a story that I'm working on now that I was working on like 4 years ago. And I finally started working on it again. And when I looked back at my early pages, I knew I probably wouldn't be using that because it was so old, but I was going to use it as a jumping off point for the story part of it. And then it turned out I couldn't use like any of it. Like it was really old and really different than how I write now, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in a way, it almost became easier to throw away those pages now because I know that I can write something so much better now. And so I also think, I don't know, anytime you write something and you've just written it, you're really, really close to it. And I think that's why it feels so hard to throw it away. But if you also know you can write something so much better, then it becomes easier to let the, you know, maybe what you would consider older or subpar writing fall away. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. In the beginning, yes, I wrote everything thinking, oh, this is going to be amazing. And I felt horrible getting rid of it. And you're right. It's easier. Also, the more you write, the less you feel that one piece of fiction is your
Right.
baby or your, the most important thing in the world, which is very freeing because you know that, yeah, you will write something else. You also reminded me the other advice I have is finish what you write before you rewrite. Because a lot of times, to your point, you're writing and you can't see what's working and not because you're in the middle of it. And
Right.
you know what you're saying, and maybe you know where you're going, maybe you don't. But a lot of times I found that scene that I struggled with and rewrote 10 times, I finished the novel, put it aside for a month, came back and said, oh, I don't need that scene at all. That scene doesn't belong there. And now I spent however much time revising it. So sometimes you're trying to fix something at a scene level, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not the issue. It
Right.
doesn't belong in the story, and you really can't see that until you're done.
Yeah.
So it's worth it to keep going. Just the other thing that was helpful to me in my writing classes was they would just say, write as much as you can, as fast as you can. And I think that that's good advice. Try to turn off that brain, that part of your brain that criticizes you and tells you it's not working when you're doing that first draft. Like just throw it on the page. And I always tell myself, just let yourself write something bad. It's okay. I do that in my
Mm-hmm.
legal writing as well. And I'm just like, no, just throw it on the page. I'll fix it later. And often it's way better than you think.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, I think finishing too just gives you sort of a bird's eye view. If you can see the entire product from beginning to end, that's really, really helpful. Um, but yeah, I also think, yeah, you have to be willing to let yourself. I mean, I think it's just different for every person. And so if you're having a hard time finishing, you need to push through and finish that. If you're not someone who has a hard time finishing and you're having a hard time rewriting scenes, then like you said, put it away and finish everything. You know what I mean? I think you just kind of need to figure out what you're struggling with and push through that. And then once you get beyond that, you'll move to the next level kind of in your craft, whatever that is for you.
That's a really good point because it's so easy to give generic advice, and yet it does depend in the beginning. For a lot of people, just getting it on the page and getting to the
Mm-hmm.
end is the struggle. But you're right. I'm much more apt. I've published about a dozen novels, and I wrote 3 or 4 before that never were published. So at this stage, if something's really not working early on in the book, in the first third, I might go back and
Right.
revise it because, to your point, I know I'm going to finish it.
Yeah.
And maybe going back and shifting that around helps me go forward. But
Mm-hmm.
my first probably 6 or so novels, I think that would have been a bad idea for
Yeah.
me because I really did need to finish it first. And maybe there are some writers who can do the rewriting as they go and they produce a first draft that is very close to
Right.
finished. And if you're someone who that's the case, if that works for you, then yeah, go with it. Don't change it because, someone
Right.
like me told you shouldn't do it that way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, and I mean, I think you're right that probably the majority of writers have a trouble finishing that first book. It's why most people can often take, years to write their first book, and then after that, they're whipping them out really fast. So
Yeah.
I think you're right about that. But yeah, I was going to say I am somebody who I don't necessarily rewrite as I'm going, but I do edit the text as I go, like more like line edits, so that it's pretty in pretty good shape by the time I'm done with my first draft. But at the same time, I didn't necessarily do that when I very first started with my first books. And, so it's just a process along the way to figure out what works best for you. And everybody's process is different.
Yeah, and your process can change over time. Or the
Probably
type of
will.
book you're writing. Yeah, it probably will. And one type of book might lend itself to a different process.
That's true.
You reminded me of something else. This is like mistakes I've made. So one of my biggest mistakes early on was rewriting too much. I would rewrite for the plot, but I would spend forever line editing. And I think it's because I like that. Like I know that I had done other kinds of writing. I knew I was good at writing a good sentence and, getting rid of all the passive voice unless it made sense and, not having sentences that were all the same length and all these things. So I would do that over and over and over and not realizing that, but it's my plot that needs the work. And until I took the books to some workshops where I got someone who could look at that, I didn't know what was wrong. So I just kept reline editing. And as a result, this was in the days where all you could do was seek traditional publishing. And so I'd get someone to read it because I wrote a good cover. My first chapter was well edited and clear, but I wasn't, they'd get part of the book and then they get the rest of the book. And then at some point it would be a no. And it wasn't till I got someone to look at it who said, no, your writing's fine. It's your plot.
Right.
I feel like the advice is like, whatever you're good at, that's great, but don't get too hung up on only doing that and thinking that's the issue. I think I just felt safer doing that.
Yeah. Which I think that's the perfect way to put it. You just get too hung up on it because that's easy for you. And the stuff that isn't easy is scary. But, that's part of, like you said, just you gotta move forward and push through whatever's blocking you from getting your work finished.
Yeah, sometimes you need someone outside to look at it and tell you, because you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know why it wasn't working. But yeah, also sometimes just writing the next thing rather than rewriting forever. Sometimes you got to go to that next story or that next novel, and that's where you sort out the issues you had.
Right. I totally agree. So, well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I think you've given us a lot of valuable insights. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I feel like I just threw out a bunch of stuff and I don't want to overwhelm people, but I do want to say thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I've listened to quite a few episodes. I think they're really helpful and I love your upbeat attitude and how encouraging you are to people.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for being here. Why don't you tell everyone where they can connect with all of your books?
Yeah, you can find my mysteries and thrillers at my author website, lisalilly.com, and that's Lilly for Lily. And you can find the books on writing craft and a bunch of articles at writingasasecondcareer.com.
Great. I will make sure and link all those up in the show notes so that people can connect with you. Thanks so much again for being here and good luck with everything.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.